Imagine taking a completely honest, totally unfiltered audit of every single thought that passes through your head for just 24 hours.
Oh, wow. Yeah, that sounds exhausting.
Right. Like every petty judgment you make about a stranger, every sudden flash of ego, every selfish
Yeah.
impulse, or, every imaginary argument you win in the shower.
I think we all have a lot of those shower arguments.
Exactly. Well, there's this ancient spiritual framework that claims that surviving this 24-hour mental audit without descending into total despair is actually the absolute first requirement for human mastery.
It's intense, but it makes sense. I mean, it forces a confrontation with the reality of our internal landscape.
Yeah.
Because we really like to think of ourselves as generally cohesive, rational beings navigating the world with clear intentions.
Yeah, we think we're the ones driving the car.
Right. But when you actually run that diagnostic, when you look at the raw data of human cognition, it resembles a chaotic, totally invisible battlefield.
And that unseen battlefield is exactly what we are exploring today. Welcome to the deep dive. We are taking you on an intensive exploration of a historical manual on spiritual combat, famously known as unseen warfare.
Which was compiled by figures like Lorenzo Scupoli and later adapted by St. Theophan the Recluse.
Yeah, but we aren't just leaving it in the dusty archives of antiquity. We are pulling this text out and dropping it right into the modern attention economy. Because this isn't about physical trenches or, geopolitical conflicts. We are dissecting the relentless, completely invisible war fought every single second within the human mind and heart.
And the stakes presented in this framework are absolute. The premise is that every human soul is an active combat zone. It's characterized by this constant grinding clash between a higher intellectual will and lower sensory desires.
Which is something I think everyone listening can relate to.
Definitely. And the objective of this warfare is clearly defined in the text as Christian perfection.
Okay, let's stop right there because perfection is a really dangerous word.
It carries a lot of baggage.
It really does. In our modern mindset, especially in this era of curated social media feeds, perfection implies flawless performance. We immediately think of strict behavioral checklists, right?
Oh, absolutely. Never making a mistake.
Yeah, projecting this flawless image of moral superiority to the outside world. And people often assume historical spiritual texts are just like massive catalogs of rituals you have to endure, like fasting, sleeping on the floor, reciting endless words, just to earn a badge of holiness.
But this specific framework aggressively rejects that interpretation. I mean, it goes out of its way to warn the reader that perfection is absolutely not found in outward rituals.
Wait, really? It explicitly says that?
Yeah, exactly. Those visible acts, the fasting, the long vigils, the physical asceticism, they're categorized merely as scaffolding. They are tools, and potentially very dangerous ones at that.
Dangerous because they can easily feed the ego, I'm guessing.
Exactly. Think about it. If someone adopts a brutal fasting regimen and suddenly feels morally superior to their neighbor who is eating a cheeseburger, that outward virtue has actually just armed the enemy.
Wow, so the good deed becomes the weapon against them.
Right. The authors actually argue that a visible public sinner is often closer to genuine transformation than someone who is, hidden under a robe of manifest outward virtues, but secretly boiling with pride.
That is fascinating.
It is. True perfection, as defined here, is the absolute union of the soul with the divine and the complete surrender of one's own will. If a tool doesn't achieve that internal surrender, it's useless. Or worse, it's actively harmful.
So the outward metric is entirely irrelevant if the internal operating system is still driven by self-importance.
Exactly.
To rewrite that internal operating system, the framework outlines 4 fundamental weapons required for this invisible combat. It also introduces a really radical concept called the theology of the senses, and it gives a tactical mindset for maintaining inner peace where all your spiritual dopamine just completely dries up.
Right, and if the ultimate goal is the surrender of our will to the divine, the necessity of the first weapon becomes logically unavoidable. You cannot surrender a will that you secretly believe is perfectly capable of running your life.
Which brings us to weapon 1, the absolute mistrust of oneself.
Yeah.
And this requires a complete paradigm shift because we live in a culture that basically preaches self-reliance, right? Like self-esteem, trust your gut, believe in yourself.
Oh, everywhere you look, that's the modern gospel.
But this framework frames self-reliance as the original spiritual sickness.
It really does. It traces this sickness back to the archetypal fall of Lucifer. The argument is that assuming we have any inherent goodness, strength, or wisdom originating entirely from our own isolated ego, that shuts the door to grace.
Because there's no room for it.
Precisely. The mechanism is simple. Divine assistance can only enter an empty vessel. If you assume your cup is already full of your own inherent excellence, there's just no room for anything outside of you to enter.
You're basically blocking your own progress by thinking you're already doing great.
Right. Every good thought or virtuous deed, according to this model, originates outside of us. Claiming it as our own intellectual property is basically a form of spiritual theft.
I want to look at how this plays out psychologically because there is this brilliant insight in the material regarding how we react to our own failures. The text identifies a phenomenon that we could call the paradox of excessive sorrow.
Ah, yes. It is one of the most acute psychological diagnostics I've honestly ever encountered in historical literature.
The authors argue that when we fail, when we break a diet, lose our temper, or fall back into a destructive habit, and we experience crushing, panicked despair, that despair is not a sign of a tender conscience.
No, it's not.
That excessive grief is actually a symptom of hidden pride.
The logic there is completely airtight. Ask yourself, why are you so devastated that you failed? You are devastated because deep down you actually believe you are strong enough to succeed on your own.
It reminds me of how a narcissist reacts to making a mistake at work.
Oh, that's a great comparison.
Right. They aren't paralyzed with grief because the mistake harmed the company's bottom line. They're paralyzed because their flawless self-image just shattered. They're literally weeping over the broken pieces of their own ego.
Exactly. Whereas a truly humble person, someone actually wielding this first weapon of self-mistrust, they aren't shocked by their own failure at all.
Because they didn't expect to succeed on their own anyway.
Right. They expect nothing but weakness from their isolated self. When they stumble, they don't descend into this huge spiral of wounded vanity. The internal monologue is essentially, well, of course I fell. I was relying on my own strength again.
That is so freeing in a weird way.
It is. They peacefully ask for assistance, dust themselves off, and resume the fight. The crushing sorrow only exists if you secretly harbor the illusion of your own invincibility.
This gives you, the listener, such a practical way to audit your own reactions. The next time you fail at a goal, just observe the emotional fallout. Are you calmly assessing the failure and moving forward, or are you despondent and panicked?
And if it's the latter, you are relying on yourself.
Exactly. And curing that reliance requires a harsh dose of reality.
It does. The authors actually propose a highly empirical experiment for this. They suggest taking one single day to meticulously track every thought, word, and deed.
We mentioned this at the start. It's essentially the mental equivalent of those apps that track your screen time, right? The ones that show you, to your absolute horror, that you spent 4 hours mindlessly scrolling.
Yeah. But this is tracking your internal cognitive noise.
The inevitable discovery of how many vain, selfish, petty, and outright destructive thoughts populate your mind in a standard 24-hour period that is the fastest possible cure for self-reliance.
You witness the sheer chaos of your own unguided cognition. It's undeniable once you look at it.
But okay, let me push back a little. Completely destroying your belief in your own competence creates a massive psychological vacuum. If I spend a day tracking my thoughts and realize my mind is just a chaotic factory of selfishness, I'm going to end up paralyzed. Total self-mistrust without a safety net is basically just a recipe for nihilism.
Which is exactly why the first weapon is fatal if deployed alone. The vacuum left by the destruction of the ego must be instantaneously filled by the second weapon, which is bold trust in God.
So you swap them out.
Yes. You're trading a flawed operating system for a flawless one.
And this trust, it isn't presented as a warm, vague feeling of, like, everything happens for a reason. It is constructed as a calculated, logical reliance based on 3 specific pillars regarding the divine nature. And those are total power, infinite wisdom, and boundless goodness.
Right. You must intellectually assent to the idea that there is a power capable of overcoming any flaw you just discovered in yourself, and a wisdom that knows the exact path required for your specific transformation.
And a goodness that actively desires your success.
Exactly.
The imagery used to illustrate this boundless goodness is incredibly intense in the source text. It expands on the classic image of the Good Shepherd, but it goes way further. It asks the reader to imagine a shepherd who spends years searching for one lost sheep, walking through briars, shedding his own blood, and enduring extreme physical agony to locate it.
The underlying argument there is one of proportionality. If the divine went to such agonizing lengths while the human was actively wandering away and ignoring the search party, how could that same divine force possibly ignore the human the moment they turn around and actively cry out for help?
It's a very compelling argument. But I have to play devil's advocate for anyone listening who is currently in the thick of a seemingly unwinnable battle.
Sure.
Because how does someone realistically maintain this bold, unshakable trust when they are actively failing? What if a person is trapped in a severe addiction or a cycle of profound anger, and they feel like they are losing this unseen war every single day? Trust is easy when you're on a winning streak, you know?
It is, yeah. But the manual anticipates that exact despair, and it counters it with the strategy of endurance. It fundamentally redefines what winning and losing look like on this specific battlefield.
How so?
Well, in this invisible combat, the only true loser is the individual who stops fighting.
So failure isn't defined by getting hit, it's defined by desertion.
Exactly. A person might be entirely overwhelmed by a vice, dragged through the mud daily despite their absolute best efforts. But as long as they do not willingly lay down their weapons, as long as their higher will refuses to sign a peace treaty with the passion and saying, they are not defeated.
They're just taking damage.
Right. They are categorized as a victorious soldier who is currently wounded and taking heavy fire, but they are still holding the line and waiting for reinforcements.
So as long as the intellectual will is still registering a firm no, even if the sensory will is acting out the vice, you are technically still in the fight.
The authors argue that the divine often intentionally delays ultimate victory to prevent carelessness, to forge deeper humility, and to test the endurance of faith. The only way to lose the unseen war is to willingly drop your sword, agree with the enemy, and stop resisting.
But realizing you are weak and help is on the way isn't a license to just sit passively in the trenches, right? If your internal state is fundamentally compromised, the enemy is already inside the wire. You have to actively fight back.
You do, which requires an understanding of how the mind actually makes choices in real time. And this leads directly to Weapon 3, the constant struggle against the passions.
This section reads like a tactical field manual for human cognition. It starts by mapping the internal anatomy of our decision-making process, dividing it into two competing forces, the intelligent will and the sensory or fleshly will.
And the parallels between this and modern behavioral economics are striking.
Yeah, I was thinking it sounds remarkably similar to Daniel Kahneman's concept of System 1 and System 2 thinking. Like it maps almost perfectly onto this. You have the automatic, sensory-driven, immediate gratification system, and you have the slower, logical, higher-order system.
It really does. The intelligent will is drawn to righteousness, long-term good, and divine law. The sensory will is drawn entirely to immediate physical indulgence, ego protection, and the path of least resistance.
Just constant comfort.
Exactly. And every waking moment is a tug of war between these two faculties.
And our free will acts as the referee. Whichever side we give our consent to, well, that side wins that specific micro-interaction. So how does the manual advise we fight this tactically? Because just swinging wildly at every random thought that pops into your head is a great way to burn out really fast.
Yeah, you'd be exhausted in an hour. The strategy requires identifying what they call the commander passion. Everyone has a primary vulnerability, a keystone habit of the mind that rules them more deeply than others.
So for one person, it might be vanity.
Right. And for another, it's a specific physical lust, or maybe a deep-seated anger or chronic greed. You must locate the general of the enemy army and direct all your artillery there first.
You don't waste ammo on the foot soldiers, you cut the head off the snake.
Mm.
The theory being that the lesser passions only survive because they are being fed by the commander.
However, there is a critical caveat regarding those lesser passions. While your main focus is the commander, you cannot ignore the seemingly insignificant faults. We tend to brush off like minor gossip, a tiny white lie, or a fleeting moment of judgment as harmless.
Oh, constantly. We excuse it all the time.
But the authors warn that ignoring these micro-failures is catastrophic.
They use a fascinating analogy here, the antlion. I found this incredibly relevant to how modern habits are formed.
I love that analogy. It perfectly illustrates how an intrusive thought or a minor passion initially presents itself as tiny and easily manageable, like an ant. You look at it and think, oh, I could crush this anytime I want. It's totally harmless.
So you just let it live in your mind.
Right. You entertain the tiny grudge, you indulge the tiny fantasy.
But by allowing it to live, you acclimatize your mind to its presence, and as it becomes a habit, it morphs. The ant rapidly grows into a devouring lion. By the time you realize it's a genuine threat, You're fighting a beast instead of stepping on an insect.
It's the compounding interest of microsins. You starve the lion by refusing to feed the ant.
And the manual gets very specific about how to handle different types of attacks, differentiating between sudden mental impulses and carnal physical desires.
The tactics are entirely opposite depending on the nature of the attack.
Let's look at sudden impulses first. Someone cuts you off in traffic, or a colleague insults your work, and you feel that immediate biological spike of anger. The manual says you have to stand your ground and block it at the perimeter of the mind. But then it prescribes a counteroffensive that sounds exactly like a technique used in modern cognitive behavioral therapy.
It does. It advises immediate opposite action.
Right. If the passion demands that you lash out and humiliate the person, you must force yourself to act with extreme kindness toward them. If you want to complain bitterly about an inconvenience, you force yourself to articulate gratitude.
You actively rewire the neural pathway by refusing to execute the passion script and running the opposite script instead.
You are forcibly exchanging the passion for its corresponding virtue. But for carnal or physical lusts, standing your ground and trying to run an opposite script is highly dangerous according to this text.
Oh, extremely dangerous. The strategy for physical lust is simply flee. Do not engage. Do not try to debate with your own biology.
Avoid the triggers, the locations, the conversations, and the media that spark it. But I want to push back on this, though, because modern psychology, especially stemming from Freud or Jung, would argue that simply fleeing and repressing physical desires is unhealthy. Doesn't repressing the shadow or running away from physical reality just cause those urges to mutate into deep-seated neuroses? Like, doesn't this risk turning people into repressed time bombs?
It is a valid modern concern, absolutely. But it misunderstands the text's mechanism. The authors aren't advocating for mere repression.
How so?
Well, repression is pushing a desire down into the subconscious while still secretly valuing it or wanting it. They're advocating for starvation. The text compares the flesh to iron that naturally generates rust. You cannot reason with rust, right? You can only remove it from the moisture that causes it.
So engaging in a mental wrestling match with a physical desire is just providing it with the moisture it needs to grow.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Every second you spend debating the physical desire, you are keeping it active in your working memory. The authors warn that the flesh will feign being subdued. It'll act as your friend for years, only to strike a fatal blow in a single moment of vulnerability. By fleeing the physical triggers, you aren't repressing the urge. You are actively dismantling the neural pathways that sustain it through intentional starvation.
Which transitions us perfectly from fighting internal impulses to how we interact with the external world, because we live in a highly stimulating physical universe. The text refers to our senses, our eyes, our ears, as the windows through which death can enter the soul.
Yeah, a bit dramatic, but effective.
Very. But it also presents a method for transforming those vulnerabilities into an impenetrable shield. Which brings us to section 4, the theology of the senses.
This is a profound cognitive reframing exercise. The core principle is that a practitioner must never allow a sensory impression to stop at the physical surface.
You train your brain to look through the object rather than at it.
Right. The physical world is treated as a vast, interactive theology book. Every element of creation is viewed as a shadow or a reflection of the invisible creator.
The examples they give are relentless. When looking at the physical elements like fire, air, water, earth, or observing plant and animal life, the mind shouldn't just register the biological facts or the aesthetic beauty. It must immediately pivot to contemplate the unseen, life-giving spirit that sustains that specific matter.
So you see a river, and you use the visual of flowing water to meditate on the boundless flowing goodness of the divine. You see the stars, and you meditate on the true light that illuminates human intellect.
It creates a state of constant associative memory, and it heavily utilizes the specific narrative of the incarnation and the passion. Right?
It does, and this part is absolutely fascinating.
Tell me about it, because if you see ordinary pieces of wood or ropes or nails at a construction site, your mind is trained to bypass the mundane reality and immediately pivot to the crucifixion. One example that really stuck with me was hearing a clock strike. In our daily lives, a clock striking just means a meeting is ending or a deadline is approaching. But the text suggests that hearing a clock should trigger a meditation on the anxiety and sorrow experienced in the Garden of Gethsemane, marking the relentless passage of time towards suffering.
You are literally hijacking the mundane triggers of the world and reprogramming them to serve your spiritual focus.
But there is a much more intense, radical side to this sensory theology, specifically regarding how to handle the physical temptations we just talked about fleeing from.
Yes, The text utilizes what is basically shock therapy for the imagination.
Right. If the eye is drawn to physical human beauty and the biological passion of lust begins to rise, the authors advise immediately visualizing that exact same body as a decaying corpse, crawling with worms and returning to dust.
The goal is to aggressively shatter the shallow illusion of sensory pleasure. You fast forward the timeline of physical biology to its inevitable, sobering conclusion.
It reminds me perfectly of the movie The Matrix.
Well, that's a good one.
Right. When Neo finally achieves his full potential, he looks down the hallway and he no longer sees the walls, the doors, or the agents. He just sees the falling green code. He is looking at the underlying reality generating the illusion.
Yeah, that's exactly it.
The theology of the senses is essentially an ancient method for seeing the code. You refuse to be seduced by the surface-level rendering of reality, whether it's the beauty of nature or the temptation of a physical body, and you force your mind to perceive the spiritual truth underneath.
It is an active rebellion against the surface level of existence. But there is a massive vulnerability here.
What's that?
Even if you master your interactions with the external world, even if you close your eyes and sit in a completely empty room, your mind is still a recording device.
Oh, the cache is full of old images.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Which brings us to the most volatile battlefield of all, correcting the imagination and the memory.
The text makes a staggering theological claim here. It asserts that the mind, in its purest original state, should be completely formless, free from sensory images, colors, and physical shapes. And it argues that Lucifer fell from his angelic state specifically by indulging his imagination.
Right. He was a formless mind, but he created a fantasy image of himself being equal to the divine. That act of imagination caused his ruin.
The framework views dwelling in a world of mental images, daydreams, and fantasies as a degraded state. When we allow our minds to endlessly replay past sensory pleasures, relitigate old arguments in the shower, or fantasize about future successes, we are keeping the soul in a constant state of passionate agitation. We are basically feeding our vices with ghosts.
The goal, therefore, is to purge the mind, to pull the attention inward, restrict it to the heart, and strip it of all worldly shapes and memories.
And the manual provides a brilliant physical analogy for this mechanism, which is the magnifying glass.
I love this part. Consider sunbeams scattered naturally in the air. They provide mild light and mild heat. You can walk through them comfortably.
And our daily attention is usually scattered just like those sunbeams, fractionated across a dozen different apps, tasks, memories, and anxieties.
But if you place a constricted magnifying glass in the path of those beams, forcing all that scattered light through a single tiny focal point, the dynamic changes entirely.
The light becomes blinding and the heat becomes intense enough to start a fire. The authors argue that the human mind operates on the exact same physical principle. When your attention is scattered, your spiritual power is weak and easily manipulated.
But when the mind is pulled away from the external world, constricted and focused entirely on a single point within the heart, it generates a spiritual heat that literally burns away intrusive thoughts and demonic images.
It creates a laser-focused awareness. The practical challenge, of course, is how to actually construct that magnifying glass. You cannot simply command the human brain to stop imagining things. The brain abhors a vacuum.
Right. If you try to think of nothing, you will immediately think of a pink elephant.
Exactly. Which brings us to weapon 4, the lens of the magnifying glass, the most vital tool in the entire arsenal. Steadfast prayer, and specifically the utilization of the Jesus prayer.
This is the operational core of the entire unseen warfare framework. But the authors are incredibly precise about what prayer actually is. Merely reciting words with your vocal cords is not prayer.
If your mouth is chanting a psalm, but your internal monologue is planning your grocery list, you are just making noise.
True interior prayer requires a unified effort. The mind must understand the words, the heart must feel them, and the will must direct them.
To achieve this focused heat, the text champions a very specific, repetitive mental invocation. Lord Jesus Christ, Son of God, have mercy on me.
The Jesus prayer. And in this tradition, it is not treated as a soothing mantra to lower blood pressure. It is described in highly militaristic terms as a double-edged sword used to actively strike down enemies.
I want to look at the mechanics of why this works, because it maps perfectly onto how cognitive science understands working memory.
Oh, tell me more about that.
Well, the brain has a limited capacity in its phonological loop, the part of working memory that deals with spoken and written material. By constantly repeating a specific phrase, you are actively occupying that loop, making it physically impossible for the brain to simultaneously spin up a complex, intrusive fantasy.
It acts as a cognitive block. The text uses the imagery of the mind acting as a sentry at the gate of the heart.
When a snake, which is their metaphor for an evil thought, a memory of a past sin, or a sudden flash of anger approaches the gate, the sentry sees it coming. But the sentry does not run out into the field to wrestle the snake.
Right, because engaging the thought means bringing it into the center of the mind, which is exactly what the enemy wants.
Instead, the sentry immediately retreats, locks the gate of the heart, and deploys the Jesus prayer. The repetition of the name acts as a weapon that crushes the snake's head, scattering the demonic illusion like smoke. You replace the intrusive thought with the divine name before the thought can take root.
It is an active, violent rejection of the intrusion.
But practically speaking, how long is someone expected to do this? Is this like a 20-minute morning mindfulness routine?
The goal presented in the manual is total saturation. It is a state called walking with God. The objective is for this short prayer to eventually run ceaselessly in the background of your consciousness 24 hours a day. It basically becomes the default operating system of the mind.
When it becomes that deeply rooted, it acts as an impenetrable wall. The moment a passion tries to arise, the turbine of the prayer is already spinning, instantly repelling it.
That is the theoretical ideal, anyway. But the authors are profound realists regarding human nature. They know that no state of heightened spiritual focus lasts forever unhindered.
Which leads us to perhaps the most comforting and grounded section of the entire manual, managing inner peace amidst spiritual dryness. Because anyone who has ever started a new diet, a new workout routine, or a new spiritual practice knows all about the honeymoon phase.
Yes. The text describes a period of spiritual warmth. These are feelings of immense joy, tender devotion, and burning zeal that are often granted to beginners.
You feel like you are floating, you have all the dopamine you need to fight the passions, but as we all know, the dopamine always runs out.
The text is unequivocal about this. A period of cooling or profound spiritual dryness is an absolute inevitability. The feelings of peace and joy will completely vanish.
And this is the exact moment where the vast majority of people abandon the war. The mind feels dead. The Jesus prayer feels like empty syllables. The enemy uses this exact dryness to induce hopelessness, whispering that your efforts are pointless, that you have been abandoned, and that you might as well return to your old physical indulgences because at least those made you feel something.
This is where the framework completely inverts conventional thinking. It argues that this bitter, desolate, emotionally dead state is not a punishment for failure. It is, in fact, a sign of advancement. It is a profound, necessary gift.
Why is feeling absolutely nothing a gift?
Because it forces a cure for spiritual gluttony.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. If you are only fighting the passions and saying your prayers because it gives you a warm, fuzzy feeling of peace, you are not actually seeking the divine. You are just seeking a refined type of pleasure. You have simply swapped out physical indulgence for spiritual indulgence.
It is a brutal realization. You're essentially just chasing a different kind of high.
The dryness strips away all pride. It proves to you undeniably that you cannot manufacture grace or peace on your own. It forces genuine humility.
The manual uses a beautiful analogy from St. Isaac the Syrian to illustrate this, the winter and spring analogy. St. Isaac observes that during the winter, all the beautiful flowers and crops vanish. The earth looks dead, barren, and frozen. But beneath the surface, the roots are actually safe, drawing nutrients deeper into the soil. When the warmth of spring finally returns, those plants bloom stronger than ever. Spiritual dryness is simply winter for the soul.
The roots of your will are growing deeper, fortifying themselves in the darkness, even when you cannot see the emotional flowers.
The ultimate test of this entire framework, the absolute proof that you are actually progressing in the unseen war, is what you do in the winter. If you continue to force yourself to do good works, if you continue to stand guard at the gate of your mind, and if you continue to wield the Jesus prayer, even when your heart feels like a stone and you experience zero emotional reward, that is when you are truly winning. You are serving not for the rations, but out of pure loyalty.
It is the ultimate expression of the first two weapons. You mistrust your own dead feelings, and you boldly trust that the warmth will return when it is truly needed.
We have mapped out a massive, challenging landscape today. We've seen that the path toward inner mastery isn't about looking holy to your neighbors or projecting an image of flawlessness. It is a brutal, relentless, invisible war for control of the internal operating system.
It requires the complete bankruptcy of the ego through self-mistrust.
It demands replacing that ego with an unshakable, calculated trust in the divine.
It requires identifying your commander passions, starving the tiny antlions before they grow, and refusing to negotiate with biological triggers.
It trains you to hack your own perception, turning the physical world into a theology book while pulling your attention away from scattered
And it
fantasies.
relies on the relentless, focused repetition of steadfast prayer to guard the heart, especially when the dopamine crashes and the winter of dryness sets in.
It is an ancient manual, but I want to leave you, the listener, with the thought about how urgently this applies to the world you are walking back into the second you take these headphones off. We talk endlessly today about the attention economy. We recognize that multi-billion-dollar algorithms, advertisers, and infinite scrolling feeds are actively weaponized to hijack our senses, fragment our memories, and keep our imaginations in a constant state of agitated desire. We act like this is a novel 21st century problem. But long before smartphones existed, the authors of Unseen Warfare understood the foundational rule of human existence. Whatever entity controls your imagination ultimately controls your soul. In a modern environment engineered specifically to scatter your mind like those unfocused sunbeams, to keep you relying on your own ego while feeding your sensory desires, perhaps the most radical, rebellious act you can possibly take is learning how to wield these ancient weapons. To step off the chaotic, visible map of the world's distractions and step purposefully onto the unseen battlefield, the greatest victory you can achieve isn't out there. It's learning how to pull your mind back into the fierce, guarded silence of your own heart.